Have you ever listened to a podcast and thought to yourself, how does the host know that I needed to hear this right now? Or how are they in my head? I was just thinking that. Or maybe, how did they know that that's something I struggle with? Well, for the past 2 weeks, I've been receiving dozens of messages from listeners saying these exact same things. And I wanted to talk about it. And funny enough, the first thing that you're going to say is like, well, you may know how to do it because you've been working in podcasting for so long that you have like an unfair competitive advantage. And I would say not really. I know my audience very well, but I've been helping small business owners all around the world have really different audiences do the exact same thing, creating content that almost feels like they are reading their listeners' minds. And you may say, hey, my audience is quite small and they're different. I don't know if you'll be able to like help me guess. Well, just carry on listening to this episode because I know that I will probably be able to give you a lot of ahas and breakthroughs on this episode. But I want you to also make sure that you understand that it's possible for you too to turn passive listeners into raving fans. I'm Xavier. I'm a podcast content strategist, and this is the Podcast Space, a podcast that will help elevate your show, but also get you unstuck. Let's go. I want you to consider what happens within the first 24 hours of you publishing an episode. Maybe you are in the category of people who work super, super hard. They promote the podcast. They spend so much time editing the show. And once it's live, you feel like the effort you put in doesn't equal the feedback that you're getting. So you're kind of like thinking, well, maybe I get 1 or 3 messages, but like they're kind of like spread out and it's not with every episode. Or you're in the category of publishing the episode and you just don't hear from anyone ever. And I will say that that's okay. That sometimes happens, but after listening to this episode, you will be able to actually pinpoint what has happened, what you did wrong, and how to fix it. So I want you to consider more like the habits that you have to change, because we all, once either we are just starting or if we've been podcasting for a while, we fall into the habit of, for instance, thinking that we know everything about our audience, or thinking that we don't need to engage in a conversation online or offline because we're just too busy. We can't think about any given time, an available time to really engage in conversation. So you're always busy. And then another thing that you may think about is like you're just not able to be consistent. You're always doing these like episode here and there. Maybe a month has like 3 episodes. Maybe the next month has like 2. The following one may have like 5 because you were super excited and you had like so much going on. Just creating content on the fly, right? Like whatever inspires you, you create. And then another one is thinking that some things are too basic to talk about, and so they're completely under you, and so you don't want to talk about them at all, or you're not having a goal for the show. These are the 5 habits that we need to change, right? And in order to know your audience and to read their minds, you have to consider things that go into the habit, right? Like the way you're thinking, the way you're behaving, because all of this, when I tell you that your audience is ready to listen to you and they're ready to engage, but there are so many things that play into it around it that they're kind of not feeling compelled enough to reach out. And so we want to turn those people who are listening and just kind of like, okay, cool, to have that urge to message you about either their aha. Like for instance, someone told me that they listened to an episode 3 different times and they were like taking notes. I mean, this is pretty powerful. Someone who is kind of like going through the bother to tell me that they listened to the same episode 3 times. Someone else said that they listened to like the whole catalog in like a day because they were just like, oh my God, like I need another one. And I was like, made me so happy. But I know that is possible for you too. So I wanted to consider like the last thing that I talk about, like not having a goal for the show. I'm going to talk about like a little bit more on why that matters. But I want you to consider who you're really creating content for. That is potentially like, we'll get into that, but I want you to kind of like pause this podcast for a second after I say what I say. And that is, are you creating content for yourself or for your audience? I want you to think about it for a second. Or who have you been creating content for so far? So I'm going to let you marinate on that. But let's get into the 5 habits that you need to change in order to be able to read their minds. And honestly, I cannot, like get into people's minds and just like make them do things or whatever. Like I really have a process. And so let's go through the first one. So number 1, you have to start being curious with your audience. And while I know like a lot of behaviors, let me tell you a little bit about you. And while I know that there are some differences, not everyone is the same profile, I'm going to tell you that I know about you that you care a lot about your community, or you care about creating content that actually matters and being surrounded by people who do the same, right? Like you are invested in creating the world a better place. You truly care about creating meaningful relationships, and you're really craving that for your audience as well. You're longing for those emails. And so something else that I know as well about you is that you have just incredible ethics. You love doing your work, but you're really serious about it, and you hold everyone to a high standard. And so you're constantly educating yourself. You're always looking to improve your skill set and just to improve in all facets of life. You're a creative person, and you are just so thrilled to be part of like the podcast community, because you know that your message is changing someone's life, or the life it's changing is yours, right? You're doing that for yourself because it's part of the self-discovery journey, or something that you want to really be devoted about maybe in the future, but not just yet. So if I got you right, and as I said, like I know that not 100% of this will apply to you, but a strong percentage will. I want you to message me, because that's exactly how I know that you are there listening. And that's just exactly just how I know that my content is resonating with you, because I know so much about you. So I want you to start asking yourself, what is it that my audience is struggling with? What is it that I am naturally always talking about, right? With, these people that, like, as a business owner, people always come to me with the same questions. Are you actually addressing those? And I'm getting ahead of myself, but a huge mistake that I see is business owners thinking that they know better than their audience. And so you have to ask yourself, do I really know everything about these people? Do I know what stresses them out? What they want to be doing, what are their dreams and their hopes for the future? These things are important, but sometimes when we are in our own industry for a while, we kind of forget the basics, right? Like how our audience is in its core. So I don't want you to look at your audience from the peer perspective. And this is a mistake that I see all the time. People think, my audience knows that. My audience knows that. Like I would have meetings with podcasters, and they would say, oh, that's something that like people obviously know. And I'm like, do they know, or do you know? And do you talk about this with your peers? Because when you're creating content for the audience who's like behind, a few steps behind you in the expertise that you have, or like, a few light years behind you, it's easy to kind of like get in our own soapbox and just kind of think about what we think they think. And I'll get to that onto how to get that information. But like, do not use lingo. I audit podcasts all the time, and I'm thinking, I wonder if this is something that the audience knows, because sometimes, the majority of times, small business owners are creating content. And this is the type of client I serve, not everyone. The majority of times, the clients that work with me, they're trying to get people who have very little knowledge about the area they're working in. And so a lot of times I like questioning them. Hey, is this lingo that your audience uses? Are these words that they use on a day-to-day basis? And a lot of times they're like, actually, no, that's no, I've never had anyone say that. And I was like, that is lingo. And so when you're using language that doesn't resonate with your audience, it kind of goes over their head. So I want you to start thinking about that, and we'll get into that. But so another one that I see a huge mistake is like a podcaster not having the most frequent asked questions as their episodes, and sometimes spending hours and hours going through explanations with clients. And I'm like, why are you doing this? Or potential clients, I'm like, you should have a podcast about this. So if you don't know your FAQs, you're maybe missing out on a ton of downloads and saving yourself time. Because that's where most of their needs fall, right? Like the questions they ask you all the time. And then something that I want you to consider as well is like, what do they need specifically from me? Not my competitor, not someone else, but how is it that how do I normally serve them in a way that they feel super excited because I can deliver that information in a way that maybe nobody can, in a style that maybe nobody can, right? Because that connection with like the host specifically will be such a different approach to just talking about the topic. Like, talk about the topic that everybody specifically asks you about to uncover. Because more often than not, you end up knowing a lot more just subconsciously. And so when you're really leaning into that like specific expertise, is just incredible what you unlock, because people just tell your passion, and sometimes they don't realize it's in their subconscious too, and they have absolutely no idea that that's there until you, with like an incredible amount of passion and knowledge, talk about that on an episode. And then number 2 is actually engaging in, either one-on-one or in groups, online or in real life, or social media, or replying to DMs privately. Because I am always surprised, because I talk to clients and I say, hey, when was the last time that you actually took notes during a client call and actually took notes of the specific words they used to describe the problem they have? And so many people don't take that simple. You don't need market research. You need to talk to your audience. Like, market research is, like a fancy way to talk to your audience, but you can do that in such an easy way. Whenever I'm working with clients, I am always taking notes of specifically the words they use, the emotion that they have, how that's connected potentially with like a limiting belief or not, or how, maybe they're like overwhelmed, but they're hopeful, or they're overwhelmed and they're burned out. Like, these are things that matter so much when you're describing the problem to your audience on a podcast episode, that really just clicks with people. And then consider, even if you don't do events, use social media. I work from home and I talk to people all the time, every day on social media, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, because that enables me to get a really like a strong pulse in what's going on without having to be on a meeting. But also, if you're like, Anna, okay, I hear you, but I don't like engaging in conversation, well, then consume the content from your ideal listener. Go and check out like what they talk about, how they feel. So for instance, I've been feeling burnt out. And so I was like, okay, is it just me? And so I go onto social media and I see what people are talking about. And multiple people were talking about how overwhelmed they were, how burned out they were. And I'm like, okay, that's a cue. That's a cue from what they're saying. And so I'm going to incorporate that into my content and say, hey, if you're feeling overwhelmed and burnout, episode 20 is going to uncover, I don't think it was episode 20. Episode 18, I talked about the replay advantage and how like you should be using replays in your strategy in order to avoid burnout. And so many people resonated with that because it didn't come out of thin air. I've been listening, right? And so much of what the work we do has to be about listening to their needs, not pushing our personal agenda, but really listening and see how can I create a content piece that is related to what they're saying and position myself as an expert. So again, if you're burned out, a replay is a great opportunity to avoid working as hard. So episode 18, check that one out. So I always want you to consider, like, think about like almost like nature, right? Like the season of life. So much of what like a segment of the population is feeling like can be extrapolated for the majority of the people in the world. But that's when you have to pay attention and see if that applies to your industry. And then number 3 is just the consistency, right? We don't trust people who are not consistent, just default, right? So even if someone is saying what we need to hear, if we don't trust them because we see them as slacker or whatever, it may not resonate as much. So think about how are they looking at you? Are they looking at you as the authority, as someone who is always there for them? That's going to be completely different. So plan your content in a way that enables you to stay consistent. Maybe you do micro episodes. Maybe you have like replays. Maybe you break episodes in parts. But make sure that you are creating content consistently, but also, and this is the important part, that is aligned with what their needs are. And so when you're looking at your content, are you just trying to find anything to be published? Are you being intentional with your content? When I'm working with clients and I ask them, hey, give me a list of the most frequently asked questions. So sometimes it comes up in conversation. I'll say, hey, there's this question that I had. Have you created a podcast episode about this? And when they tell me like, no, I didn't create it, that I haven't created that yet. And I'm like, why? They're like, well, there's other stuff. And I'm like, well, you have a few other episodes that do not do anything either for you or your audience. Why did you record that? And they're like, well, because I didn't have a plan, so I needed to create something. So that's hurting your reach because your audience is kind of like, why are they talking about this? This makes no sense. So while you're thinking it's better to release something than nothing, that's when I'm like, do a replay instead of creating something that is going to be misaligned. And then also, I want you to look at the analytics because a lot of times there's a lot of unspoken questions that are like underlying. So if you see in your analytics that there are specific topics that people constantly go for, like for instance, for me, I know that questions about planning, questions about how to repurpose the podcast, how to think about it differently, how to maximize it for your podcast, for your business. I know these questions are always asked of me. Like they always say, hey, I'm spinning my wheels. I feel like I'm not using enough of my podcast. I know those episodes are going to be super popular. I know that the episodes with guests where I'm talking about different things are not going to be as played, but I know that my baseline is there. So look at your analytics. If you never did, I think it's important to look because the numbers don't lie in a way, right? But they need to be put in context. So if you have a spike in a specific topic, why is that? All right, number 4, thinking that some things are too basic to talk about. Like this is the major mistake. And this is because either two things. Either you're assuming your audience knows, and the assuming part is the most dangerous one. Thinking that your audience already is kind of quote unquote has graduated from that type of content. And most times it isn't because you will have new listeners coming through all the time. So sometimes it's good to refresh that knowledge. And again, replays are fantastic for it. You don't have to constantly be talking about the same thing, but it's important to know that, a lot of times we assume that that's a baseline knowledge to our audience when it isn't. And then this is when you have to check yourself and be like, am I doing this? Because I talk to so many podcasters who are like, that's too basic for me. I don't do that level. I don't do that. It's too basic for the type of work that I do. Well, sometimes it is, but sometimes things are connected. And it's important to let them know that you also can master talking about B while you're on F already, right? So looking back and thinking, do I do I need to break down B so that they understand F? Because sometimes that's what happens. Your knowledge is kind of advanced, but there are a few things that your audience will love, will be really excited about, and be like, oh my God, they really are the person who I've been needing for so long, or this problem that I have in my business, they are the ones because they can level down with me, right? And for instance, you don't have to talk about all things. Like, I don't talk about, for instance, how to set up your podcast on podcast platforms. I don't talk about equipment. That's not my expertise. That's not how, like, sure, it's part of the basic knowledge, but I'm here for content strategy. So how to set up content pillars, talk about the types of audiences you have on your podcast. Those things I talk about, but I won't talk about like the basic, like, where do you pick the music? I don't talk about that. And I'm not saying that you should either. So there's always like a middle ground. So find that one. And number 3 of like thinking that some things are too basic to think about is that you're afraid of your peers judging you and thinking you're like, they will judge me because I know so much and I'm here talking about basic stuff. When in fact, that expression that explained it to me as if I was 5 years old or something like that. Most people cannot do that because it's actually so hard. Sometimes you have so much knowledge that breaking that down to like a level that isn't a level that you're normally used to talking about, it can be really difficult. And so a lot of people think, well, if I'm going to talk about, basic stuff, my peers are going to judge me because I'm such an intelligent person. And I'm like, sure. Yeah, but like, how do you make money? Is it about helping your peers? And if that's helping your peers, sure, the content has to be like geared to them. But yeah, don't be afraid of them judging you. I had so many clients I had to coach them through creating episodes that became what's called super episodes. Episodes that will always perform very well in the long run because they were just so afraid of judgment. They're like, well, I knew deep down that's what it was through a few comments, but I didn't say it. But I knew that once those episodes were live, even peers were like, this is such a great episode. I've actually never looked at it that way. You're so knowledgeable. I never thought that you could do like an in-depth dive in a beginner level. And then they actually got work out of it. I was like, see, that works. So again, sometimes you might be surprised about what the reasoning is behind it. Sometimes it's not, again, your audience, it's you thinking, you're worried. And then last but not least, determining the goal. Like, I talk about this on episode 4, choosing a goal for your podcast, because you cannot read an audience mind that you don't know. If you are unsure of who you're serving, you have absolutely no clarity. How can you create content that is exactly what they need when you're not even sure who they are, right? So I want you to consider, are you creating a content for the larger audience or for the person in front of you? And the person in front of you, for instance, being if you're using your podcast to network with decision makers and try to get into their good graces, really warm up that connection. If that's the case, the type of content that you're going to be creating, it has absolutely nothing to do with the type of content that you would be creating if you're serving someone who is not in the level that you are. And then impact. If you're looking to create impact, if you're really craving, this is the podcast that I'm creating, it's almost like my legacy. If you're wanting to say, I want to create impact, you also have to quantify it. Are you okay with receiving 2 emails, in a week? Or do you want to be 2 in a month? But also know that if your podcast is super niche, super small, right, like it's very specific, the type of audience you're serving, for instance, if you are someone who is a life coach, you're going to have a ton more people to be listening to the podcast as if someone who specializes in like the C-suite. It's not the same amount of people who will consume that content. So in terms of impact, a C-suite audience will probably not email as much as someone who has, anybody and everybody who needs life coaching. So just to be mindful of like the scale as well. And then if you're thinking about leads, when is it that, if you're thinking about, okay, I want them to think that I'm reading their mind so that they can obviously understand that I am the right person to serve them when they have a problem, where, it's super different than if all you want to do is create impact with your work. If you want just legacy, if you're not looking to do business with these leads, why are you wanting to read their minds? Be very clear, because then the call to action at the end has to be different. If you're just, share your house with me is different than saying, hey, let's work together, right? So that's something that I want you to consider when you're looking, like what type of content do they need in order to feel like you're reading their mind, and the next step is, X. So it's not just reading their minds, it's also what do you want them to do next? That is the missing piece for most people. So just to recap, 5 habits that you need to start working on. 1 is being curious about your audience and not assuming. Number 2, actually engaging one-on-one or in groups, online or in real life, to get those words that they're using, right? So on social media, replying to DMs, replying to your emails. Number 3 is consistency. Planning, creating content that solves the problem that they have, but also serves a purpose for you. And then number 4, thinking that, there's no such thing as too many basic things to discuss. Your audience is on a different level, and you have to level up with where they are. And sometimes it's leveling down. So you're not too good to talk about anything. Just solve your audience's problem. And then 5, determining the type of content that you need to create in order to have that reaction. Like, what is the goal of the podcast? So if you are listening to this and you're like, Anna, I see that I've been doing so many things wrong with my strategy, or at least like misaligned with my goals, but I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Let's work together on getting that done, because it's so much fun when you work with someone else, because I do it about it myself as well, right? Like, I create content and sometimes I'm too close to it. It's good to have a different pair of eyes. And so if you're ready to start receiving feedback more frequently and just receiving that feedback that we all love, that is like, this episode resonated with me, this helped me, achieve blah, 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 or I've never heard anyone talk about this, I didn't realize I had this issue, I want to work with you, right? So if you want to talk a bit more about it, you can talk to me on Instagram. I'm at the podcast space, and all the resources mentioned in this episode, like the episode number 4, episode 20, the links will be there as well in the show notes. But always go back to thepodcastspace.com/podcast for all these things. I've been Anna Xavier, and this was the Podcast Space. I hope you got unstuck and inspired to elevate your podcast journey. I'll see you next episode.